At my son's retirement party, 40 of his Navy buddies filled my backyard in Charleston, celebrating 20 years of service. Then, halfway through his speech, he stopped mid-sentence, walked straight to me, and said quietly, "Dad, don't let Rachel leave the property tonight. Please." 6 words. No explanation. My smile never moved. But the man inside me who'd spent 30 years reading blueprints and building contracts for a living knew something had gone wrong. And I knew, right then, it was time to pay attention. "I'm glad you're here with me today. Tell me, friend, where are you joining me from tonight?" I read every single answer. Stay close, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. A quick note before we start. Some names and details here have been changed, and a few elements are shaped for storytelling. But the heart of what happened is real, and I think you'll feel it. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 34 years as a structural engineer. The kind of man who checked load calculations twice and still worried he'd missed something. You learn things in that job that don't leave you. You learn that the failures you can't see are the ones that kill people. A hairline crack behind a wall. A beam that looks fine until the day it isn't. I thought understanding structures made me good at understanding people too. I was wrong about that, though not in the way you'd expect. My name is Walter Hines. I live outside Charleston, South Carolina, on 11 acres my wife and I bought back in 1994, back when the land out there was still cheap and the herons still outnumbered the houses. We built a low white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and Carol planted a garden along the east side that, even now, 4 years after she passed, still comes up every spring like she never left. Carol was my wife for 38 years. She died in November of 2022, 11 months after her diagnosis. Ovarian cancer, stage 2 when they found it, which the doctor said, gently, was actually fortunate timing, all things considered. I remember sitting in that office at MUSC, the fluorescent lights too bright, my hand wrapped around hers, and asking the doctor the same question every husband asks. How long if we fight it? He looked at Carol, then at me, and said, "With treatment, there's a real chance." Carol squeezed my hand before I could ask anything else and said, "Walter, let the man finish his sentence." That was Carol, steadying me even when she was the one who needed steadying. We fought for 11 months, chemo, then a clinical trial in Atlanta, then chemo again. She kept teaching piano lessons out of our front room until the fatigue made her hands shake too much to demonstrate the scales. She didn't tell her students why she stopped. She didn't want their pity. She wanted them practicing. Our son, Ethan, was stationed in Norfolk at the time, a Navy lieutenant with 11 years in already, and he drove down every leave he could get, sometimes just for a weekend, sleeping in the chair beside his mother's hospital bed so I could go home and shower and sleep for 3 hours before driving back. Ethan is steady, careful, the kind of man who reads the fine print on everything, which is exactly why what happened later hurt him the way it did. On the last good day Carol had, she was lucid for almost 2 hours, sharper than she'd been in a week. She held my hand and told me she needed me to promise her 2 things. The first one, she said, was simple. Stop taking on private consulting jobs. Retire. Sit on that porch and watch the herons, I promised. Then she went quiet for a moment, and her eyes did something I recognized from 38 years of marriage. The look she got when she was about to say something she'd clearly been turning over for a while. The second thing, she said, is about Ethan. When he finds someone, and Walter, he will. You watch. Really watch. Don't let your guard down just because you like her. I frowned and asked what she meant. She tightened her grip on my hand, weaker now but still Carol underneath it. Our son gives his whole heart the second someone's kind to him. He always has. That's beautiful. And it's also exactly how good people get taken advantage of. Promise me you'll pay attention. Not for you, for him. I promised. 2 days later, she was gone. In the years after, I kept the first promise easily enough. I sold my share of the engineering firm, turned down every consulting call, and spent my days on that porch, in that garden, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, just to have something to do with my hands. The second promise sat in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. I didn't understand what Carol had seen coming. Not until the night Ethan called me from Norfolk, his voice carrying something I hadn't heard from him in years. Genuine, unguarded happiness. It was a Thursday in March, the kind of gray, damp evening where the marsh smell hangs heavy over the low country, and I was at the kitchen table paying bills when my phone lit up with his name. Ethan didn't usually call on weeknights, unless something was wrong, so my chest did that thing it still does, even now, that half second of dread before I pick up. "Hey, son. Everything all right?" "Yeah, Dad. Actually better than all right." His voice had a lift to it I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "I met someone." The words tumbled out fast, like he'd been holding them in and finally let go. Her name was Rachel Doyle, 29, a financial planner who'd recently moved her practice down from Richmond to be closer to her sister in Norfolk. They'd met at a charity 5K for veterans, and afterward she'd asked him real questions about his deployments, not the polite kind people ask to fill silence, but the kind where you can tell they're actually listening for the answer. My heart did something complicated hearing that. Pure joy for him, because Ethan had spent 4 years alone after a hard breakup he never fully talked about. The kind of quiet a father learns not to push on. And underneath that joy, something smaller, quieter. The same instinct that used to make me walk a job site twice before signing off on it. Something about, she asked him real questions and moved down from Richmond, landed in my gut wrong, though I couldn't have told you why. I pushed the feeling down and told him I couldn't wait to meet her, and I meant it. I want you to understand that. I meant every word. Rachel came down for the first time 2 weeks later, and I'll be honest with you, friend, she was easy to like. Warm. Funny in a dry way that matched Ethan's own humor. She brought a bottle of good bourbon and asked about Carol's garden with what looked like real interest, kneeling down to read the little plant markers Carol had painted years ago. She cried a little when Ethan told her about his mother, and I remember thinking, well, Carol, if you're watching, I don't know what you were worried about. But Carol's voice stayed with me anyway. Trust, but verify. I didn't act on it. Not yet. I just noticed things. Small things. The way Rachel's phone never left her hand, even at dinner. Face down, but always within reach. The way she described her financial planning clients in broad strokes, high net worth families, generational wealth transfers without ever naming a firm or a certification. The way she asked, almost in passing, over dessert one night, whether Ethan's military pension and benefits were structured through a survivor annuity or a straight pension, and how quickly she smiled and changed the subject when I glanced up. I told myself I was being an old man who missed his wife and needed something to be suspicious of. I told myself that for months, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think a lot of you have talked yourselves out of a gut feeling the same way I did. By summer, Ethan and Rachel were engaged. He called me the morning after he proposed, so happy I could hear him grinning through the phone, and asked if we could host the engagement party at the farmhouse in September. Of course, I said. Of course. The party was beautiful. I'll give her that. 40 of Ethan's Navy friends and their families filled the yard under string lights Rachel had strung herself, and the September evening was warm enough that everyone stayed outside past dark. Rachel's family came down from Richmond, her mother, her sister, an uncle who kept refilling everyone's glasses and telling long stories about a boat he used to own. They seemed like good people, ordinary people. That's what got me, if I'm honest. Con artists don't look like con artists. They look like the neighbors you'd trust with a spare key. Ethan stood up to give a toast around 9 o'clock, glass raised, Rachel's hand in his, and he was maybe 2 sentences into it, thanking everyone for coming, thanking Rachel for choosing him, when he stopped, just stopped, mid-sentence, the whole yard going quiet, waiting for him to find his place again. He didn't. He looked down at Rachel for half a second, something crossing his face I'd never seen on my son before, and then he walked straight across the yard to where I was standing by the drink table. "Dad," he said, low enough that only I could hear it, "don't let Rachel leave the property tonight, please." Then he turned around, walked back to the toast, picked up right where he'd left off like nothing had happened, and finished it beautifully. The whole yard clapped. Rachel kissed him. String lights, laughter, somebody's kid running through the grass with a sparkler, and me standing there with a champagne glass in my hand, my pulse hammering, replaying 6 words that made absolutely no sense and every kind of sense at once. I didn't sleep that night. I want to tell you honestly, friend, that I have never in my life felt so torn between 2 instincts. My son had just handed me something urgent, and refused to explain it in front of 40 guests, and every part of me wanted to march across that yard and demand answers right then. But 34 years of reading blueprints taught me something too. You don't tear into a wall before you know what's holding the ceiling up. Rachel stayed the night, as planned, in the guest room down the hall, and I lay awake listening to the house settle, listening for her door, for anything. Nothing happened. At 6 the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, I found Ethan out by the fence line, already awake, coffee in hand, staring at the marsh like it owed him something. "Talk to me," I said. It came out of him, in pieces. 2 nights before the party, Rachel had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she showered, and Ethan, refilling his water glass, had seen an email thread still on the screen. Not snooping, he was careful to tell me. Just there, right in front of him, subject line and all. It was addressed to someone named Gregory Voss, and the subject line read, "Timeline, Hines, Survivor, Benefit, Final Phase." He'd only had seconds before she came back, but he'd seen enough. Language about a beneficiary restructuring window, about the 60-day post-marriage adjustment period, about needing the wedding date locked before the fiscal quarter closed. Ethan is not a suspicious man. He told me, standing there by the fence with his coffee going cold, that he'd almost talked himself out of what he'd read, told himself it was industry jargon he didn't understand, some ordinary planning document, except for one line at the bottom, from this Gregory Voss, that Ethan said he'd read 4 times just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. "Once you're listed as spouse and beneficiary, we move fast. He won't see it coming until it's done." My son, 20 years in the Navy, a man trained to stay calm under real pressure, said his hands were shaking reading it. I felt that cold drop in my chest, the one you feel when a calculation you trusted turns out to be wrong. I asked him if he'd said anything to Rachel. He said no. He said he'd spent 2 days rehearsing how to act normal, and the toast had nearly broken him, standing up there thanking her, while that sentence sat lodged behind his teeth. "We are not confronting her," I said, and I said it fast, before he could suggest it, because I could see it in his face, that soldier's instinct to move directly at a threat. "Not yet, son. Listen to me. If this is what it looks like, she is not doing this alone, and she is not doing it for the first time. The moment she knows we've seen anything, she disappears, and this Gregory Voss disappears with her, and we never learn what they actually planned or who else they've done this to." Ethan's jaw worked the way it does when he's forcing himself to sit with something he wants to act on immediately. "So I marry her anyway? I keep pretending?" "You keep gathering information," I said. "There's a difference. I still know people. Give me a week." I called Frank Delgado that same morning. Frank had been my attorney for 2 decades, handled the firm's contracts back when I still had a firm. And if there's one thing I learned watching that man work, it's that he can find the seam in any document faster than anyone I've ever met. I told him what Ethan had seen, and Frank went quiet in that particular way lawyers go quiet when they already suspect the answer. "Walter," he said, "does Ethan have a survivor benefit plan through the Navy? A significant one?" He did. 20 years of service, and with the additional coverage Carol had insisted he take out years ago. "Just in case, because your father worries too much to sleep otherwise." Her words, the SBP was substantial. 6 figures a year, guaranteed, payable to a named spouse for the rest of that spouse's life, regardless of whether Ethan lived another 50 years or 5. Frank explained it to me slowly, the way he does when he wants to make sure a thing lands properly. Once a spouse is named beneficiary on a survivor benefit plan like that, there's a limited early window, 60 days in most cases, where the designation can be locked with minimal review, particularly if it's filed alongside a change of marital status. After that window, changing the beneficiary requires the service member's consent and a formal process. But inside that window, if something happened to the service member in accident, anything the benefit paid out to whoever was named, no questions asked. Fast. "You're telling me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "that if Ethan marries this woman and something happens to him in the 2 months after, she walks away with a guaranteed income for the rest of her life?" "I'm telling you," Frank said, "that you need to find out who Gregory Voss is before that wedding happens. Today if you can." I hung up and called a man I'd known since our sons went through basic training together. A retired investigator named Curtis Boone, who did private work now out of Savannah. Quiet, careful, the kind of man who never once returned a call before he had something worth saying. I gave him the name Rachel Doyle, the name Gregory Voss, and told him I needed answers inside a week, not because I doubted my son's judgment, but because I trusted my late wife's more. Curtis called me back in 4 days, and I could hear in the first 10 seconds of his voice that it wasn't good news, though I already knew that much myself. Rachel Doyle wasn't her real name. Her real name was Renee Dobbins, and she'd operated under 3 different identities in the last 6 years across Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee. Gregory Voss was not a financial associate. He was her husband, not her ex-husband, her current husband, a fact confirmed by a marriage certificate from a county clerk's office in Knoxville that had never been dissolved. Together, they had run this pattern at least twice before that Curtis could confirm. Renee would embed herself with a military service member or first responder carrying substantial survivor benefits or life insurance, marry them inside a compressed timeline, and in both prior cases, the men had died within 18 months of the wedding. One in what was ruled a boating accident off the Georgia coast. One in what was ruled an accidental overdose after what family members described, in a police report Curtis had pulled, as uncharacteristic prescription drug use in his final months. I sat at my kitchen table with that report in my hands and felt something in my chest go entirely cold and entirely still, the particular stillness of a man who has just understood, completely, what he almost let happen to his son. I drove to Norfolk myself. I didn't call ahead. Ethan met me in the parking lot of a diner off base, and I laid the file out on the hood of my truck and let him read it himself, page by page, because I needed him to hear it in Curtis's careful, documented language, not filtered through his grieving, furious father. I watched my son, a man who had stared down real danger in places I'll never fully know about, go pale reading a police report about a dead man in Georgia he'd never met. "The wedding's in 3 weeks," he said finally. "I know. What do we do?" "We let her think it's still happening," I said. "Right up until it doesn't." That was the hardest month of my life since the one where I buried Carol. Ethan went back to Rachel, to Renee, and kept every plan moving forward exactly as scheduled. The caterer, the invitations, the tailor for his dress uniform, while Curtis Boone quietly built a file thick enough to hand a federal prosecutor, and Frank Delgado quietly ensured the Navy's Survivor Benefit Office flagged the designation for manual review the moment any paperwork came through, without ever tipping their hand as to why. Ethan told me later that the hardest part wasn't the lying. It was the small moments where Renee would reach over and take his hand watching a movie, and some old, wounded part of him would ache for the woman he'd thought she was, right alongside the part of him that wanted to be sick. 2 weeks before the wedding, NCIS got involved, because a case that spans state lines involving fraud against a service member's federal benefits doesn't stay a private family matter for long. And honestly, friend, I was relieved the moment it stopped being just us. There is only so much weight 2 men and a good lawyer should have to carry alone. They arrested Renee Dobbins on a Tuesday morning, at the small rental house in Norfolk she'd been using as her base. 3 days before, she was supposed to walk down an aisle in my backyard, in a dress Ethan had already paid for. Gregory Voss was arrested the same morning in Knoxville. The charges, when they finally came down months later, ran to conspiracy, wire fraud, and identity theft across 3 states. And in the course of the investigation, 2 other families came forward. Families of men who died under circumstances nobody had questioned closely enough at the time. Families who finally had a name and a case number to attach to a grief that had never made sense to them. Ethan testified. So did I. I sat in a federal courtroom in Norfolk, the kind of room I understood the architecture of better than most people in the gallery, and I watched a prosecutor lay out, piece by piece, exactly what Carol had somehow sensed coming years before any of it happened. Renee Dobbins pled guilty rather than face trial on all counts. She's serving 11 years. Gregory Voss took a plea as well, cooperating in exchange for a lighter sentence and testimony against her. At sentencing, the mother of the man who died in the boating accident stood up and read a statement to the court, and I will not try to repeat her words to you here, because they weren't mine to keep, but I will tell you that when she finished, Ethan reached over and took my hand the way he used to when he was small enough that my hand was the only thing keeping him steady on a boat dock. And he didn't let go until the judge finished speaking. The healing after that moved slow, the way most real healing does. Ethan took leave, more than I'd ever known the Navy to grant him, and spent most of it at the farmhouse, walking the same fence line I walk most evenings, not talking much some days, talking for hours on others. He went to see someone in Norfolk, a counselor who specialized in exactly this particular kind of betrayal, the kind that doesn't just break your heart, it makes you doubt your own judgment down to the studs. I understood that particular damage better than most fathers could have, and not because of anything Carol ever did, but because I'd sat across from Rachel Doyle at my own dinner table and told myself I was imagining things. By spring, he was back to himself in the ways that mattered most. Steadier, quieter, but himself. And then, this past June, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with no occasion attached to it at all, he called me, and I heard something in his voice I recognized instantly, because I'd been listening for it for a year. "Dad, I want to bring someone by this weekend," he said. "Her name is Marisol. She teaches high school biology outside Norfolk. And Dad, she doesn't talk about herself much. Mostly she asks questions about the ranch, about Mom, about you, and actually waits for the answers." I smiled so wide sitting alone in my kitchen that I probably looked foolish. "Bring her Saturday," I said. I called Curtis Boone that same week, out of old habit now more than genuine fear, and he called back 2 days later with exactly what I expected, a clean record, an actual teaching certification I could verify with 2 phone calls, a history that had been lived rather than built for a purpose. Marisol arrived Saturday afternoon with a jar of her grandmother's fig preserves and asked, unprompted, if she could see Carol's garden. She knelt right down at the plant markers the same way Rachel once had, except this time it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a woman who understood that grief and love live in the same soil. Ethan caught me watching them from the porch later that evening, and he came and sat beside me, quiet for a minute before he spoke. "You ran a check on her already, didn't you?" "Old habit," I said. He laughed, low and real, a sound I hadn't heard from him in over a year. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, for believing me that night at the party when I know it made no sense at all. Your mother knew this day would come," I told him, "long before either of us did. She made me promise to be ready for it." He looked out over the marsh, the light going gold the way it does out here in the evenings, and asked me if I thought she'd known it would get this bad. "No," I said, "but she knew you'd need someone paying attention, and she knew I'd need a reason to keep paying attention to anything at all after she was gone." She was right, both times. That night, after Ethan and Marisol had driven back toward Norfolk, I walked the fence line alone, the way I do most evenings, all the way out to the old cypress post, where Carol used to stop and turn back toward the house. I stood there a long while, listening to the marsh settle into night, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard her voice, clear as anything, telling me I'd kept my promise, both of them, and that I could rest easy now. I'm 62 years old, and I've learned more in the last 2 years than in 3 decades of engineering work. You spend your whole career learning to trust what you can measure, what you can calculate, what you can prove with a formula. Nobody teaches you how to trust your gut about a person, and nobody teaches you that the quiet, uneasy feeling in your chest when something doesn't add up deserves the same respect you'd give a crack in a load-bearing wall. I nearly ignored that feeling. I'm asking you, friend, from the bottom of my heart, not to make the same mistake. If there's one thing I want you to carry with you tonight, it's this. Loving someone with your whole heart and staying alert to protect them are not opposites. My son loved fully, the way his mother taught him to, and it very nearly cost him everything. Watching over the people you love isn't a lack of trust in them. It's the deepest form of trust there is, the kind that says, "I will pay attention to what you cannot see coming, so that your good heart never has to pay the price for it." This was never really a story about revenge. It was about a father keeping 2 promises to a woman he loved for 38 years. It was about a son brave enough to walk away from his own toast, to whisper 6 words that saved his life. And it was about the plain truth that justice, however long it takes to build, is always worth the wait. To every parent listening tonight, Your instincts matter more than you know. Your presence matters. If this story moved you even a little, tell me in the comments and share it with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Subscribe so the next story finds you when it's ready. And thank you truly for staying with me all the way to the end tonight.